All right, we are live. Greetings and welcome back once again. This is Imuna Yisrael, Solonamas 101, the Lev Project. We are on, what is this? Part number 7 of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Missed you guys yesterday. I'm trying to get it in. I have to try to get everything in. We still open to volunteers if you desire to read. I know you've been hearing me read successively, but like I said, until I get some volunteers, I'm down for reading because I'm reading anyway. So, I just click on the hangout and do it. But definitely, we still desire for your voice to be heard. So feel free to contact me on social media, even under this. But hold on, let me make sure that we have up. I'm learning to man the stations here before I actually get started. Yeah, the group chat is on under the video. So feel free to tune in if you so desire or let your voice be heard. We're currently at chapter 16 of the Love Project. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get this up here. Somebody's writing in this side box.
Voice be heard.
Okay.
We're at
There we
chapter.
go. Okay, let's see. Working with it. All right, let me just go ahead and jump into it. I'm a little bit tight today on time. So we're going to read as much chapters at the time allots. Scenes at the plantation. Early the next morning, wait, I didn't give you the run up to this point. A lot of stuff has been going on. If you miss it, go ahead and check back. Dr. Flint is getting turned up. They about to send her to another plantation with some young misses. The son, I believe, is about to get married. The doctor is mad because she still won't comply. She's pregnant. She had 2 children by this time. She gave us a little bit of understanding of what's going on, what was going on in the churches, how they used to put Europeans in there to monitor over the messages and different things like that. So if you missed it, some good stuff. So make sure you go back and get that. We're going to go ahead and start now. Scenes at the plantation. Early the next morning, I left my grandmother with my youngest child. My boy was ill and I left him behind. I had many sad thoughts as the old wagon jolted on. Hitherto, I had suffered alone. Now my little one was to be treated as a slave. As we drew near the great house, I thought of the time when I was formally sent there out of revenge. I wondered for what purpose I was now sent. So she's on her way. I'm just making sure that I could be heard. Okay. I could not tell. I resolved to obey orders so far as duty required. But within myself, I determined to make my stay as short as possible. Mr. Flint was waiting to receive us and told me to follow him upstairs to receive orders for the day. My little Ellen was left behind in the kitchen. It was a change for her who had always been so carefully tended. My young master said she might amuse herself in the yard. This was kind of him since the children was hateful to his sight. My task was to fit up the house for the reception of the bride. In the midst of sheets, tablecloths, towels, drapery, and carpeting, my head was as busy planning as were my fingers with the needle. At noon, I was allotted to go to Ellen. She had sobbed herself to sleep. I heard Mr. Flint say to his neighbor, I've got her down here and I'll take to the notions out of her. I've got her down here and I'll soon take the notions out of her head. My father is partly to blame for her nonsense. He ought to have broke her in long ago. The remark was made within my hearing, and it would have been quite as manly to have made it to my face. He had said things to my face which might or might not have surprised his neighbor if he had known of them. He was a chip off the old block. So this is Flint's child, talking about he should have broke her in long ago, this, that, and the third, and really speaking about you like an animal. I resolved to give him no cause to accuse me of being too much of a lady, so far as work was concerned. I worked day and night with wretchedness before me. When I lay down beside my child, I felt how much easier it would be to see her die than to see her master beat her about, as I daily saw him beat other little ones. The spirit of the mother was so crushed by the lash that they stood by without courage to remonstrate. How much more must I suffer before I should be broke in to that degree? I wished to appear as contented as possible. Sometimes I had an opportunity to send a few lines home, and this brought up recollections that made it difficult for a time to see calm and indifferent to my lot. Notwithstanding my efforts, I saw that Mr. Flint regarded me with a suspicious eye. Ellen broke down under the trials of her new life. Separated from me with no one to look after her, she wandered about and in a few days cried herself sick. One day she sat under the window where I was at work, crying that weary cry which makes a mother's heart bleed. I was obliged to steel myself to bear it. After a while it ceased. I looked and she was gone. As it was near noon, I ventured to go down in search of her. The great house was raised 2 feet above the ground. I looked under it and saw her about midway, fast asleep. I crept under and drew her out. As I held her in my arms, I thought how well it would be for her if she never waked up. And I uttered my thought aloud. I was startled to hear someone say, "Did you speak to me?" I looked up and saw Mr. Flint standing beside me. He said nothing further, but turned, frowning, away. That night, he sent Ellen a biscuit and a cup of sweet milk. This generosity surprised me. I learned afterward that in the afternoon he had killed a large snake which crept from under the house, and I suppose that incident had prompted his unusual kindness. The next morning, the old cart was loaded with shingles for town. I put Ellen into it and sent her to her grandmother. Mr. Flint said I ought to have asked his permission. I told him the child was sick and required attention which I had no time to give. He let it pass, for he was aware that I had accomplished much work in a little time. I had been 3 weeks on the plantation when I planned a visit home. It must be at night, after everybody was in bed. I was 6 miles from town and the road was very dreary. I was to go with a young man who I knew often stole to town to see his mother. You have to steal to go see your family. One night when all was quiet, we started. Fear gave speed to our steps and we were not long in performing the journey. I arrived at my grandmother's. Her bedroom was on the first floor and the window was open, the weather being warm. I spoke to her and she awoke. She let me in and closed the window lest some late passer-by should see me. A light was brought and the whole household gathered around me, some smiling and some crying. I went to look at my children and thank God for their happy sleep. The tears fell as I leaned over them. As I moved to leave, Benny stirred. I turned back and whispered, "Mother is here." After digging at his eyes with his little fist, they opened and he sat up in the bed looking at me curiously. Having satisfied himself that it was I, he exclaimed, "Oh, Mother, you ain't dead, are you? They didn't cut off your head at the plantation, did they?" My time was up too soon and my guide was waiting for me. I laid Benny back in his bed and dried his tears by a promise to come again soon. Rapidly, we retraced our steps back to the plantation. About halfway, we were met by a company of 4 patrollers. Luckily, we heard their hoofs before they came in sight, and we had to hide behind a large tree. They passed, hollowing and shouting in a manner that indicated a recent carousal. How thankful we were that we had not their dogs with them. They had not their dogs with them. We hastened our footsteps, and when we arrived on the plantation, we heard the sound of the hand mill. The slaves were grinding their corn. We were safely in the house before the horn summoned them to their labor. I divided my little parcel of food with my guide, knowing that he had lost the chance of grinding his corn and must toil all day in the field. Mr. Flint often took an inspection of the house to see that no one was idle. The entire management of the work was trusted to me because he knew nothing about it, and rather than hire a superintendent, he contented himself with my arrangements. He had often urged upon his father the necessity of having me at the plantation to take charge of his affairs and make clothes for the slaves, but the old man knew him too well to consent to that arrangement. When I had been working a month at the plantation, the great aunt of Mr. Flint came to make him a visit. This was the good old lady who paid $50 for my grandmother. Sorry about that. I don't even know where the phone is at.
Call from the
Okay, sorry. All right. Where were we? Oh, the woman who paid $50 for her grandmother. Okay, for the purpose of making her free when she stood on the auction block. My grandmother loved this old lady whom we all called Miss Fanny. She often came to take tea with us. One such occasion, that table was spread with snow white cloth, and china cups and silver spoons were taken from the old-fashioned buffet. There were hot muffins, tea rusks, and delicious sweetmeats. My grandmother kept 2 cows, and the fresh cream was Mrs. Fanny's delight. She invariably declared that it was the best in town. The old ladies had cozy times together. They would work and chat, and sometimes while talking over old times, their spectacles would get dim with tears and would have to be taken off and wiped. When Miss Fanny bade us goodbye, her bag was filled with Grandma's best cakes, and she was urged to come again soon. There had been a time when Dr. Flint's wife came to take tea with us, and when her children were also sent to have a feast of Aunt Fanny's nice cooking. But after Auntie Martha's, that's her grandmother, nice cooking. But after I became an object of her jealousy and spite, she was angry with grandmother for giving shelter to me and my children. She would not even speak to her in the street. This wounded my grandmother's feelings, for she could not retain ill will against a woman who she had nourished with her milk when she was a babe. The doctor's wife would gladly have pretended our intercourse with Mrs. Fanny if she could have done it, but fortunately she was not dependent on the bounty of the Flints. She had enough to be independent, and that is more than can ever be gained for charity, however lavish it may be. So Mr. Dr. Flint's wife, Linda's grandmother, nursed her. So there is a wild, crazy, dynamic, dysfunctional family, and I use that term loosely, dynamic between what's really going on. Miss Fanny was endeared to me by many recollections, and I was rejoiced to see her at the plantation. The warmth of her large, loyal heart made the house seem pleasanter while she was in it. She stayed a week, and I had many talks with her. She said her principal object in coming was to see how I was treated and whether anything could be done for me. She inquired whether she could help me in any way. I told her I believed not. She consoled with me in her own peculiar way, saying she wished that I and all my grandmother's family were at rest in our graves, for not until then should she feel any peace about us. The good old soul did not dream that I was planning to bestow peace upon her with regard to myself and my children, not by death, but by securing our freedom. Again and again I had traversed those dreary 12 miles to and from town, and all the way I was meditating upon some means of escape for myself and my children. My friends had made every effort that ingenuity could devise to effect our purchase, but all their plans had proved abortive. Dr. Flint was suspicious and determined not to loosen his grasp upon us. I could have made my escape alone, but it was more for my helpless children than for myself that I longed for freedom. Though the boon would have been precious to me, above all price, I would not have taken it at the expense of leaving them in slavery. Every trial I endured, every sacrifice I made for their sakes, drew them closer to my heart and gave me fresh courage to beat back the dark waves that rolled and rolled over me in a seemingly endless night of storms. For those who've just joined us, this is the Lev Project. We're reading Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. We're currently on chapter 16. All right, she planning her escape. It says the 6 weeks were nearly completed when Mr. Flint's bride was expected to take possession of her new home. The arrangements were all complete, and Mr. Flint said I had done well. He expected to leave home on Saturday and return with his bride the following Wednesday. After receiving various orders from him, I ventured to ask permission to spend Sunday in town. It was granted, for which favor I was thankful. It was the first I had ever asked of him, and I intended it should be the last. It needed more than one night to accomplish the project I had in view, but the whole of Sunday would give me an opportunity. I spent the Sabbath with my grandmother. A calmer, more beautiful day never came down out of heaven. To me, it was a day of conflicting emotions. Perhaps it was the last day I should ever spend under that dear old sheltering roof. Perhaps these were the last talks I should ever have with the faithful old friend of my whole life. Perhaps it was the last time I and my children should be together. Well, better so, I thought, than that they should be slaves. I knew the doom that awaited my fair baby in slavery, and I determined to save her from it, or perish in the attempt. I went to make this vow at the graves of my poor parents, in the burying grounds of slaves. There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary be at rest. There the prisoners rest together. They hear not the voice of the oppressor. The servant is free from his master. I knelt by the graves of my parents and thanked God, as I had often done before, that they had not lived to witness my trials or to mourn over my sins. I had received my mother's blessing when she died, and in many an hour of tribulation, I had seemed to hear her voice, sometimes chiding me, sometimes whispering loving words into my wounded heart. I have shed many bitter tears to think that when I am gone from my children, they cannot remember me with such entire satisfaction as I remembered my mother. The graveyard was in the woods and twilight was coming on. Nothing broke the death-like stillness except the occasional twitter of a bird. My spirit was overawed by the solemnity of the scene. For more than 10 years I had frequented this spot, but never had it seemed to me so sacred as now. A black stump at the end of my mother's grave was all that remained of a tree my father had planted. His grave was marked by a small wooden board bearing his name, the letters of which were nearly obliterated. I knelt down and kissed them and poured forth a prayer to God for guidance and support in this perilous step I was about to take. As I passed the wreck of the old meeting house where, before Nat Turner's time, the slaves had been allowed to meet for worship, I seemed to hear my father's voice come from it, bidding me not to tarry till I reached freedom or the grave. I rushed on with renovated hopes. My trust in, and she keeps saying God, had been strengthened by the prayer among the graves. My plan was to conceal myself at the house of my friend and remain there a few weeks till the search was over. My hope was that the doctor would be discouraged, and for fear of losing my value and also subsequently finding my children among the missing, he would consent to sell us, and I knew somebody would buy us. I had done all in my power to make my children comfortable during the time I expected to be separated from them. I was packing my things when grandmother came into the room and asked what I was doing. I'm putting my things in order, I replied. I tried to look and speak cheerfully, but her watchful eye detected something beneath the surface. She drew me towards her and asked me to sit down. She looked earnestly at me and said, Linda, do you want to kill your old grandmother? Do you mean to leave your little helpless children? I am old now and cannot do for your babies as I once did for you. That's her great grandchildren. I replied that that if I went away, perhaps their father would be able to secure their freedom. Oh, my child, she said, don't trust too much in him. Stand by your own children and suffer with them till death. Nobody respects a mother who forsakes her children. And if you leave them, you will never have a happy moment. If you go, you will make me miserable the short time I have to live. You will be taken and brought back, and your sufferings will be dreadful. Remember poor Benjamin. Do give it up, Linda. Try to bear a little longer. Things may turn out better than we expect. If you don't remember what happened to Benjamin, Benjamin is the grandmother's son who tried to run away and they brought him back. So Granny is a little bit, concerned. She says, my courage failed me in view of the sorrow I should bring on that faithful, loving old heart. I promised that I would try longer and that I would take nothing out of her house without her knowledge. Whenever the children climbed on my knee or laid their heads on my lap, she would say, poor little souls, what would you do without a mother? She don't love you as I do. And she would hug them to her own bosom as if to reproach me for my want of affection. But she knew all the while that I loved them better than my life. I slept with her that night, and it was the last time. The memory of it haunted me for many a year. On Monday, I returned to the plantation and busied myself with preparations for the important day. Wednesday came. It was a beautiful day, and the faces of the slaves were as bright as the sunshine. The poor creatures were merry. They were expecting little presents from the bride and hoping for better times under her administration. I had no such hopes for them. I knew, listen to this part very interesting. I knew that the young wives of slave holders often thought their authority and importance would be best established and maintained by cruelty. And what I had heard of young Mrs. Flint gave me no reason to expect that her rule over them would be less severe than that of the master and the overseer. Truly, the colored race are the most cheerful and forgiving people on the face of the earth. That their masters sleep in safety is owing to their superabundance of heart. And yet they look upon their sufferings with less pity than they would bestow on those of a horse or a dog. That's true, you know. We very forgiving people, sometimes to a fault. I stood at the door with others to receive the bridegroom and bride. She was a handsome, delicate-looking girl, and her face flushed with emotion at the sight of her new home. I thought it likely that visions of a happy future were rising before her. It made me sad, for I knew how soon clouds would come over her sunshine. She examined every part of the house and told me she was delighted with the arrangements I had made. I was afraid old Mrs. Flint had tried to prejudice her against me, and I did my best to please her. All passed off smoothly for me until dinner time arrived. I did not mind the embarrassment of waiting on a dinner party for the first time in my life, half so much as I did the meeting with with Dr. Flint and his wife, who would be among the guests. It was a mystery to me why Mrs. Flint had not made her appearance at the plantation during all the time I was putting the house in order. I had not met her face to face for 5 years, and I had no wish to see her now. She was a praying woman, and doubtless, considering my present position, a special answer to her prayers. Nothing could please her better than to see me humbled and trampled upon. I was just where she would have me, in the power of a hard, unprincipled master. She did not speak to me when she took her seat at the table, but her satisfied, triumphant smile when I handed her plate was more eloquent than words. The old doctor was not so quiet in his demonstration. He ordered me here and there and spoke with peculiar emphasis when he said, "Your mistress." I was drilled like a disgraced soldier, and when all was over and the last key turned, I sought my pillow, thankful that God had appointed a season of rest for the weary. The next day, my new mistress began her housekeeping. I was not exactly appointed maid of all work, but I was to do whatever I was told. Monday evening came. It was always a busy time. On that night, the slaves received their weekly allowance of food. 3 pounds of meat, a peck of corn, perhaps a dozen herrings were allowed to each man. Women received 1.5 pounds of meat, a peck of corn, and some number of herring. Children over 12 years old had half the allowances of women. The meat was cut and weighed by a foreman and the field hands and piled on planks before the meat house. Then the second foreman went behind the building, and when the first foreman called out, "Who takes this piece of meat?" he answered by calling someone's name. The method was resorted to as means of preventing partiality in distributing the meat. The young mistress came out to see how things were done on her plantation, and she soon gave a specimen of her character. Among those in waiting for their allowance was a very old slave who had faithfully served the Flint family through 3 generations. When he hobbled up to get his bit of meat, the mistress said he was too old to have any allowance, that when niggers was too old to work, they ought to be fed on grass. Poor old man, he suffered much before he found rest in the grave. My mistress and I got along very well together. At the end of a week, old Mrs. Flint made us another visit and was closeted a long time with her daughter-in-law. I had my suspicions what was the subject of the conference. The old doctor's wife had been informed that I could leave the plantation on one condition, and she was very desirous to keep me there. If she had trusted me as I deserved to be trusted by her, she would have had no fears of accepting that condition. When she entered her carriage to return home, she said to young Mrs. Flint, "Don't neglect to send for them as quick as possible." My heart was on the watch all the time, and I at once concluded that she spoke of my children. The doctor came the next day, and as I entered the room to spread the tea table, I heard him say, "Don't wait any longer. Send for them tomorrow." I saw through the plan. They thought my children being there would fetter me to the spot. and that it was a good place to break us all in abject submission to our lot as slaves. After the doctor left, a gentleman called who had always manifested friendly feelings toward my grandmother and her family. Mr. Flint carried him over to the plantation to show him the results of labor performed by men and women who were unpaid, miserably clothed, and half famished. They love showing off other people's work. Sorry. The cotton crop was all they thought of. It was duly admired, and the gentleman returned with specimens to show his friends. I was ordered to carry water to wash his hands. As I did so, he said, "Linda, how do you like your new home?" I told her new home. I told him I liked it as well as I expected. He replied, "They don't think you are contented, and tomorrow they're going to bring your children to be with you. I'm sorry for you, Linda. I hope they'll treat you kindly." I hurried from the room, unable to thank him. My suspicions were correct. My children were to be brought to the plantation to be broke in, quote unquote. To this day, I have felt grateful to the gentleman who gave me this timely information. It nerved me to immediate action. Okay, I'm gonna read. I'm gonna go right on through and read. It's a 2-pager. The flight is about to get on and popping right now. Yeah, I'm gonna read the flight and then we're gonna reconvene, most I willing. Yeah, because the other one is kind of long. Okay, this one is the flight, chapter 17. Mr. Flint was hard pushed for house servants, and rather than lose me, he had restrained his malice. I did my work faithfully, though not, of course, with a willing mind. They were evidently afraid I would leave them. Mr. Flint wished that I should sleep in the great house instead of the servants' quarters. His wife agreed to the proposition, but said I mustn't bring my bed into the house because it would scatter feathers on her carpet. I knew when I went there that they would never think of such a thing as furnishing a bed of any kind for me and my little one. I therefore carried my own bed, and now I was forbidden to use it. I did as I was ordered, but now that I was certain my children were to be put in their power in order to give them a stronger hold on me, I resolved to leave them that night. I remembered the grief this step would bring upon my dear old grandmother, and nothing less than the freedom of my children would have induced me to disregard her advice. I went about my evening work with trembling steps. Mr. Flint twice called from his chamber door to inquire why the house was not locked up. I replied that I had not done my work. "You have had time enough to do it," said he. "Take care how you answer me." I shut all the windows, locked all the doors, and went up to the 3rd story to wait till midnight. How long those hours seemed, and how fervently I prayed that God would not forsake me in his hour of utmost need. I was about to risk everything on the throw of a die, and if I failed, oh, what would become of me and my poor children? They would be made to suffer for my fault. At 12:30, I stole softly down the stairs. I stopped on the 2nd floor thinking I heard a noise. I felt my way down into the parlor and looked out of the window. The night was so intensely dark that I could see nothing. I raised the window very softly and jumped out. Large drops of rain were falling, and the darkness bewildered me. I dropped on my knees, then breathed a short prayer to God for guidance and protection. I groped my way to the road and rushed towards the town with almost lightning speed. I arrived at my grandmother's house, but dared not see her. She would say, "Linda, you are killing me." And I knew that would unnerve me. I tapped softly at the window of a room occupied by a woman who had lived in the house several years. I knew she was a faithful friend and could be trusted with my secret. I tapped several times before she heard me, and at last she raised the window and I whispered, "Sally, I have run away. Let me in, quick." She opened the door softly and said in low tones, "For God's sake, don't. Your grandmother is trying to buy you and the children. Mr. Sands was here last week. He told her he was going away on business, but he wanted her to go ahead about buying you and the children, and he would help her all he could. Don't run away, Linda. Your grandmother is all bowed down with trouble now." I replied, "Sally, they're going to carry my children to the plantation tomorrow, and they will never sell them to anybody so long as they have me in their power. Now, would you advise me to go back?" "No, no, child," or "No, child, no," answered she. "When they find you is gone, they won't want to plague up the children. But where is you going to hide? They knows everybody in They knows every inch of this house. I told her that I had a hiding place, and that was all it was best for her to know. I asked her to go into my room as soon as it was light and take all my clothes out of my trunk and pack them in hers, for I knew Mr. Flint and the constable would be there early to search my room. I feared the sight of my children would be too much for my full heart, but I could not go out into the uncertain future without one last look. I bent over the bed where lay my little Benny and baby Ellen. Poor little ones, fatherless and motherless. Memories of their father came over me. He wanted to be kind to them, but they were not all to him. But they were not all to him, correct, as they were to my womanly heart. I knelt and prayed for the innocent little sleepers. I kissed them lightly and turned away. As I was about to open the street door, Sally laid her hand on my shoulder and said, "Linda, is you going all alone? Let me call your uncle." "No, Sally," I replied. "I want no one to be brought into trouble on my account." I went forth into the darkness and rain. I ran on till I came to the house of the friend who was to conceal me. Early the next morning, Mr. Flint was at my grandmother's inquiring for me. She told him she had not seen me and supposed I was at the plantation. He watched her face narrowly and said, "Don't you know anything about her running off?" She assured him that she did not. He went on to say, "Last night she went off without the least provocation. We had treated her very kindly. My wife liked her. She will soon be found and brought back. Are, are her children with you?" Sorry, "Are her children with you?" This is the other Mr. Flint. He had me confused. This is the son. When told that they were, he said, "I'm very glad to hear that. If they are here, she cannot be far off. If I found out that any of my niggers have anything to do with this damn business, I'll give them 500 lashes." As he started to go to his father's, he turned around and added persuasively, "Let her be brought back, and she shall have her children to live with her." The tidings made the old doctor rave and storm at a furious rate. It was a busy day for him. My grandmother's house was searched from top to bottom, and my trunk was empty. They concluded I had taken my clothes with me. Before 20 o'clock, every vessel northward bound was thoroughly examined, and the law against harboring fugitives was read to all on board. At night, a watch was set over the town. Knowing how distressed my grandmother would be, I wanted to send her a message, but it could not be done. Everyone who went in and out of her house was watched closely or closely watched. The doctor said he would take my children unless she became responsible for them, which of course she willingly did. The next day was spent in searching. Before night, the following advertisement was posted at every corner and in every public place for miles around. $300 reward. Runaway for the subscriber. An intelligent, bright mulatto girl named Linda, 21 years old, 5'4", dark eyes, black hair inclined to curl, but it can be made straight. Has a decaying spot on her front tooth. She can read and write. In all probability would try to get to the free states. All persons are forbidden under the penalty of law to harbor or employ and said slave. $150 will be given to whoever takes her in the state, and $300 if taken out of the state and delivered to me or lodged in jail. Signed, Dr. Flint. Of course, you know, very, very interesting stuff. That's the end of the reading. We just bust out 2 chapters today. We'll pick up back on chapter 18. It's so interesting that you know, they went to so much lengths, the Europeans, the slave masters, slave owners, to convince you that you were nothing, to convince you and I and our foreparents that we had no value, that you were dumb and you were silly. But they spent a terrible amount of time chasing you down, spent a lot of time spending money to recover you. But if you had no value, then why were you so valuable? Because, you know, you were doing the work. Our foreparents were doing the work. The nation was built on the work. The Caribbean, Americas was built on the backs of slaves. And this just goes to show you that as soon as she's missing for one night, you're coming to recover her with such fervency. And we know why Dr. Flint is in it, because, you know, he still didn't get his taste with his old self. So definitely it's just something to consider, that, you know, there's a mind game going on here, you know, and we can see it in their temperament, in the way in which they related to this incident. And it's not just this. When you read the narratives and when you read the history, they really were upset when slaves would run away, but wouldn't understand why slaves would run away. You know, who wants to be in that condition? So definitely, I pray this is helping. It's definitely helping me. Sometimes it gets kind of heavy. Sometimes just got to let it process, you know, and come back to it. It's a topic that we definitely not going to get in 1-2 sittings, but prayerfully as we go along, our mind will continue to open up and we'll experience certain levels of healing in our soul, where in our DNA has been passed down onto us. So until next time, I'm going to have to log off now. I have another engagement at 8 o'clock, but I had to get this in. So I want to thank you for joining us and being here presently. I pray everybody have a blessed evening. And tomorrow is, no, today is Thursday. So we will reconvene. I think I'm going to try and read early tomorrow. Trying to get it in early tomorrow. So until next time, everybody have a blessed night. Shalom.